This is the international edition of the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting. Prodded by new lower interest rates, the bulls of Wall Street stampeded today, and when the dust cleared, records were broken around the board. Business correspondent Ray Brady explains why all that may be good news for consumers as well as investors.
One broker put it this way: they were, he said, screaming to buy stocks. And that screaming and buying sent the Dow Jones Industrial Average up nearly 20 points to a record high, closing over 1,300 for the first time in its history. Trading was heavy and prices rose on both exchanges.
There were a lot of people that were worried about the economy sliding into recession late this year and early '86, and they didn't see any way out of the box.
One way out came from the Federal Reserve Board, which cut the rate banks have to pay to borrow money. So now they can lend it out more cheaply. Today, many of them cut their prime lending rate for business from 10.5% to 10%, the lowest that rate has been in nearly 7 years. Americans may not feel the change immediately, but consumer rates also should drop, making it easier to buy cars, houses, all the kind of spending that speeds up the economy. Mortgage rates, for example, already are dropping from 13.75% to 12.5%. A saving on a $60,000 mortgage of $562 a year. And mortgage rates may be going even lower.
We would not be surprised to see them get down into the 11–12% area as this year progresses.
Wall Streeters say there will still be gloomy numbers coming out on the economy, and there's still concern about the deficit in Washington. But as long as it looks like we're making progress on those fronts, they say, the stock market could keep going up. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
The Commerce Department today reported that with significant numbers of Americans now receiving their income tax refunds, after-tax personal income in April jumped a record 2.9%. And the report said personal spending rose 0.7% last month. Near Naples, Florida today, a 5,200-acre fire threatened to jump fire lines close to Alligator Alley, a main east-west highway through the Everglades. And not far away, a 3,000-acre grass fire near the commercial district of Fort Myers, Florida, closing shops and offices and forcing the evacuation of more than 100 patients from a mental hospital. And Bruce Hall reports a change in the weather changed optimistic forecasts about the possibility of containing the worst wildfires in Florida history.
It was a bad morning for Florida firefighters. The winds changed directions and regained intensity, rekindling hundreds of fires that were brought under control only yesterday.
This wind is fanning the fire and making it more difficult to keep the fire contained.
Over the past 4 days, the fires have blackened over 125,000 acres, destroying nearly 400 homes. Water-dropping helicopters are being used to douse blazes and wet down homes in the path of the fires. But there is little a homeowner can do as the wind-whipped blazes jump fire lines and threaten subdivisions.
We've had a lot of ups and downs this last 2 or 3 days. It's every time you think you're safe, you're not.
Patty Galloway was given the all-clear to return home only yesterday. Now she may be forced out again.
I've got everything packed. It's on the back porch. I've loaded it all up in the car once, and I'll do it again if I have to.
Hundreds of firefighters are being flown in to help the 5,000 already here. Most of the fires have been caused by the lack of rain, high winds, and extremely dry brush and forest.
In the last 10 or 15 years, we have never seen a fire season where the entire state of Florida was in such dry situations.
A welcome sight late today. A few showers moved into North Florida, but officials say they do not appear to be heavy enough to put the fires out. Bruce Hall, CBS News, Volusia County, Florida.
After 2 years of secret talks, Israel today got the release of the last 3 of its soldiers captured during the invasion of Lebanon. In exchange for them, Israel had to release more than 1,100 prisoners, most of them Palestinians and Lebanese, but also including one Japanese who was one of the country's most notorious convicted terrorists. Some of the Israeli-held prisoners were freed in Israel, but many were flown to Geneva, and Larry Pentak is there.
From the moment the first Israeli military jet carrying Palestinian prisoners touched down here this morning, both sides were on guard. The Israeli prisoners had been paraded before the press in Damascus, then were unexpectedly flown to Austria, the country that negotiated the trade. The three had been kept separated for most of their 2.5 years. The captivity seemed to have taken its toll on Sergeant Hesse Schei. He spoke quietly to himself throughout the flight, apparently lost in his own world. Flanked by his captors, Private Joseph Groff said he's learned to respect the Palestinian cause.
I personally will fight for peace, as a human being.
On the ground in Geneva hours later, the trade finally got underway. Israel's PLO prisoners, who'd been held on board in handcuffs, filed off one of the planes onto waiting buses. In return, Sergeant Schei was allowed to go free. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, another stage of the drama was being played out. Across Israel, busloads of Palestinian prisoners returned to their homes, happy to be free.
Feel very good.
But at Geneva, hardened guerrillas boarded planes for Libya, among them a Japanese Red Army terrorist. Some West Bank settlers object to the trade. They staged a noisy demonstration tonight. Today, the 1982 invasion of Lebanon cost Israel a little bit more. The Palestinians come away from this with freedom for almost everyone they sought, and the satisfaction of knowing they forced Israel's hand. Larry Pintack, CBS News, Geneva.
24 years and 1 month after the failed Bay of Pigs operation, the United States today successfully invaded Cuba. It was done by the Voice of America, using a new 50,000-watt radio station transmitting from the Florida Keys. There was swift and sharp reaction from the Cuban government. Richard Schlesinger has more about Radio Martí.
Muy buenos días y bienvenidos a Radio Martí.
Radio Martí went on the air this morning 4 months late, but the reaction in Cuba was instantaneous. Even before the music and news broadcast started, the Cuban government canceled a recent immigration agreement. Fidel Castro had agreed to take back Cuban criminals sent here during the 1980 Mariel boat lift if the U.S. would resume issuing visas to Cubans who want to come here. Ironically, the agreement was canceled just as the first group of Cubans covered by it arrived in Miami. The Reagan administration has said Radio Martí's news broadcast will be fair, not propaganda, that Cuban citizens need a source of news not controlled by Castro.
I think that a good informed citizen can hold the Cuban government or whatever government more accountable for their own actions.
Castro had threatened to retaliate against American broadcasters if Radio Martí went on the air. Cuba has transmitters that are 10 times more powerful than American transmitters. In 1982, the Cubans used their radio power to push American stations off the air as far away as Salt Lake City. But supporters of Radio Martí downplay the threats of Cuban retaliation, saying they are not new.
He'll say he'll do anything, but you can't back down in front of a two-bit dictator.
With no immigration agreement, about 20,000 Cubans who want to come to the U.S. will be unable to leave. That agreement was considered a sign that relations between the two countries could improve. But today's developments seem to have placed U.S.-Cuba relations back to where they were before, on ice. Richard Schlesinger, CBS News, Miami.
City life clearly is no bowl of berries for the untamed bear. But Jerry Bowen reports some creatures find the concrete canyons a fine place to ride the wild wind.
It doesn't seem right somehow, the rare and endangered peregrine falcon thriving right smack in the middle of noisy, polluted urban America. We usually think of falcons riding the hot air currents, the thermals, off someplace like the sheer face of Yosemite's El Capitan. But the truth is, the fierce peregrine can't tell the difference between a high cliff and a high rise.
It's very efficient for them to use the thermals around the building just like it was on a cliff. There's plenty of prey, so they do just fine in the cities.
Their prey is big city pigeon, and that is why the peregrine can be found in New York City, around the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and in San Francisco, on the Bay Bridge, where they are neighbors to the sea lions, and in Salt Lake City, where the peregrines can be seen circling the stately Hotel Utah. And this time of year, people who watch falcons are watching the nesting box, looking for an egg or two. That includes Building Superintendent Hugh Sendegard, who's very protective of the falcon's 9th floor roost.
My prediction is they won't lay their egg over there, but they'll lay it right down underneath us on the outside edge of the building.
In that urban canyon called Los Angeles, 2 peregrine have a home on the 38th floor of a bank, and a friend in the bank chairman, who installed cameras and a television monitor to watch their nesting boxes.
It's the residual effect of being a Boy Scout a long, long time ago, I think.
So far, though, no eggs have appeared on former Boy Scout Harrigan's television monitor. Across the city, however, on a 26-story high ledge, is a pile of white fluff that represents two very awkward and very hungry peregrine chicks. As the adult peregrines shriek their annoyance, sometimes diving at a nature photographer clinging to his own perch, a naturalist inches toward the high-rise roost to band the chicks, part of the effort to keep track of the peregrine population.
Both of the young were fine.
The chicks were hatched in captivity, then placed in this nesting box in exchange for eggs the female had left. But there's no doubt the adoptive parents will raise them as their own, raise them to be urban falcons. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Los Angeles.
500 trillion to 1. Those are the estimated odds against natural conception of septuplets. Today in Orange, California, a woman who had taken a fertility drug was delivered of 7 babies. Jerry Bowen reports.
The cesarean section went extremely well this morning. All 7 babies were out in 3 minutes.
And 6 of the babies, 4 boys and 2 girls, survived the delivery. Birth induced 2 months before full term because of the weakening condition of the mother and the danger to the developing fetuses. As it was, 1 female infant was stillborn, and doctors feared they might lose another had they waited another day.
And right now, Pat is quite stable. She will be in intensive care for 2 or 3 days.
The mother, 30-year-old Patty Frustasi, who had taken the fertility drug Pergonal for the birth of 1 son a year ago and 6 more children today, gained 70 pounds during the pregnancy. Her normal weight is 115. After this morning's delivery, the infants, weighing from just 1 pound 1 ounce to 1 pound 13 ounces, were rushed to intensive care, a 5-person medical team to monitor each of them around the clock. Father Sam Frustasi witnessed it all, barely. His is a typical California story.
As soon as I got on the freeway, it was bumper-to-bumper traffic. And so I went on the emergency lane all the way from Riverside to Orange County. And the shoulder, people were waving at me and screaming, said, "Hey, how are you?" type of thing.
We've got words from the news service that Mrs. Frustasi has delivered all the children.
At nearby Rubidoux High School, where Patty Frustasi teaches English, there was applause and relief and no small amount of disbelief when the announcement came.
Everybody was pretty worried about her, but we're all glad that she's all right.
I can't believe somebody's capable of carrying 7 babies.
The newborn's father is also thinking of big numbers. The medical bills will be at least $700,000 to be paid by insurance and from the sale of story rights. There's a house to expand and names to be given. The infants are simply labeled alphabetically now, A through F.
We will probably associate the name of the children with the letter that they were given. So with I don't even remember if we got a boy or girl at A. I know A is a girl, so we might name it Ashley, Amberley, somewhere in that area there.
But with the joy and amazement, there is the grim reality that premature infants as small as the Frustasi babies have only a 40% chance of survival. Jerry Bowen, CBS News, Orange, California.
One of the nation's biggest military contractors, General Dynamics, today was cited and punished somewhat by the Pentagon for breaches of ethics. So was one of the nation's biggest military names, retired U.S. Navy Admiral Hyman Rickover. But the punishment was nothing like what the Defense Department's own Inspector General is calling for to settle the case of General Dynamics and the way it spends taxpayer dollars. Pentagon correspondent David Martin reports.
Navy Secretary John Lehman today withheld about $600 million worth of new contracts from General Dynamics, the country's 3rd largest defense contractor. In a letter to General Dynamics Chairman David Lewis, Lehman said the Navy would not sign contracts for a new Trident nuclear missile submarine and an air defense missile until the firm adopts a new code of ethics and settles its outstanding billing disputes.
What we feel is a widespread attitude that let the buyer beware. And we don't like that attitude from defense suppliers. The public should expect a higher standard of public trust and integrity to defense suppliers than we'll pay up if you catch us.
Lehman also said General Dynamics had given Admiral Hyman Rickover $67,000 worth of gifts in an effort to curry favor with the father of the nuclear navy. Lehman issued a letter of censure to the retired admiral and punished General Dynamics by fining the company $670,000 and canceling outright 2 contracts worth $22 million. On Capitol Hill, critics said Lehman hadn't done enough.
I think General Dynamics is probably chuckling, and they are convinced that they now have a wholly owned subsidiary in the form of the Department of the Navy and the Treasury of the United States.
don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. And when you're dealing with a contractor that does as much business as we do with these divisions, you have to be prepared to make exceptions where the overwhelming national interest requires it.
Rickover says his conscience is clear. General Dynamics says it wants to resolve its problems with the Navy as quickly as possible. In the past, said Lehman, promises from General Dynamics have often been followed by a prompt return to business as usual. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon. It typifies the work done by others we may take for granted, the difficult, sometimes dangerous job of drilling for offshore oil. That work accounts for 14% of all U.S.-produced crude oil. Today, a big rig being moved from a Louisiana bayou into the Gulf of Mexico tipped, killing at least 6 men, leaving another 6 missing. Sandy Gilmore has the story of death and drama in the Gulf.
23 men were aboard the oil drilling barge Tonkawa when it capsized while being towed late last night. 2 men survived several hours in an air pocket and were rescued by divers who heard them tapping on the hull. The Coast Guard said 9 more men were rescued from the waters of Bayou Chene in South Louisiana near Morgan City. Many of the men apparently were asleep in the bunk room when the rig capsized. Anxious friends and relatives waited throughout the day for word of more survivors, but the death toll rose as divers recovered more bodies.
We don't know whether the people we're waiting for is dead or alive. We don't know anything. They're not letting us know nothing.
The 200-foot-long barge is used for oil drilling in shallow, marshy coastal waters. It is operated by the Temple Drilling Company, a small Houston partnership, according to an industry publication. Severe thunderstorms with winds up to 80 miles an hour slowed search efforts this afternoon. The Coast Guard has begun a formal investigation. Sandy Gilmore, CBS News, New Orleans.
A federal mediator today reported momentum as she met with negotiators for striking pilots and United, the nation's largest airline. At the same time, Ned Potter reports there is concern over the first illegally disruptive incidents in the 5-day-old walkout.
Northwest 349, right turn heading 360.
The communications between plane and ground are open to anyone with the right radio equipment.
United 285 stuck a turn on 290 heading to Port.
And the FAA says that since the strike, at least half a dozen United flights have encountered interference, somebody interrupting with bursts of static, or in a couple of cases, unleashing streams of obscenities at non-striking pilots.
The controller would say United and somebody would key a mic, and then there would be a garbled transmission for a while, and then they'd let it up and you'd get just the tail end of it.
The cases were serious enough to provoke a telegram from FAA Chief Donald Engen, warning that the FAA will not condone such irresponsible actions. Malicious interference on radio frequencies can have a direct impact on the safety of the traveling public.
Any communication that is not strictly business is strictly against regulations. The FAA warns that if need be, it will take criminal sanctions against any violators.
But who are those violators? The company says they're probably pilots, but the pilots' union says it can't imagine such a thing.
We think that the charge comes from the company. It's a harassing tactic, and we question why the federal government so immediately gives it credence.
The strikers say this is war, and in fact, this command post at United Corporate Headquarters is known as the War Room. The airline has been hiring and training pilots in Denver to replace the strikers, but many of them say they'll refuse to cross the picket line.
I can safely say that this is the poorest training I've ever had anywhere.
For 2 days now, the union and the company have been meeting with federal mediators, but not reporting progress. The stakes in this battle for the air keep getting higher. Ned Potter, CBS News, Chicago.
Florida officials now are saying that brush fires in the Daytona Beach area that charred thousands of acres and destroyed or damaged hundreds of homes are virtually out. Dog-tired firefighters got a badly needed assist from up to 3 inches of rain that drenched the area late yesterday. However, accompanying lightning started some new small fires, even as the rain was helping put out the others. Officials say major fires near Naples and Port Charlotte on Florida's lower west coast are still causes for worry. Most people are fat because they eat too much. That said,